Right now, a tanker carrying crude oil is navigating one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil passes through that narrow channel every single day. Meanwhile, 3 years on, the war in Ukraine continues to redraw the map of global energy supply, and it's not just gas. The conflict has pushed oil prices higher, adding pressure to markets already stretched by Middle East tension. And here, in New Zealand, we're not immune. Power prices have risen 21% in just 3 years. Last year alone saw a steep 12% jump, and electricity prices are forecast to rise a further 5% in 2026. The result? Energy markets that are more volatile, more unpredictable, and more consequential than at any point in a generation. So what does all of that mean for you here in New Zealand? That's what we're here to find out. Welcome to What's Current. Welcome to What's Current. I'm your host, Campbell McMath. I'm a renewable energy developer based in Canterbury, New Zealand, with hands-on experience across hydro, solar, energy trading, and building and operating generation assets. This podcast exists because energy is the story of our time, and New Zealand is right in the middle of it. Every episode will be cutting through the noise on what's happening in energy markets, the technology reshaping how we power our lives, and what it all means for you. So whether you're deep in the industry or just starting to ask the questions, welcome aboard. Let's get into it. Wow, what a month to be starting a podcast. There are some amazing facts I've dug up while doing research for this podcast. Petrol is currently $3.27 a litre as of late March 26. This is well above the global average of $1.40 US, about $2.24 New Zealand per litre. National fuel prices have climbed around 55 cents per litre for petrol and 90 cents per litre for diesel since the start of the Middle East conflict. New Zealand government has updated its national fuel plan in response to supply uncertainty driven by the Middle East conflict and has temporarily allowed fuel meeting Australian specifications to be sold in the New Zealand market. New Zealand's combined onshore and on-water fuel stocks sat at about 46.6 days of cover as of late March. The government says there is no need for Kiwis to change how they buy fuel. Some interesting facts we dug up on about the Strait of Hormuz. Basically, it's the choke point of the whole situation. So the Strait of Hormuz is the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, making it one of the world's most strategically important choke points in 2024. Oil flow through the strait averaged 20 million barrels per day. That's the equivalent to about 20% of the global petroleum liquids consumption. This strait, it's only just 34 kilometres at its narrowest point. Brent crude surpassed $100 per barrel on the 8th of March 2026. This is the first time in 4 years, basically since the Ukraine war, where it rose to $126 per barrel at its peak. Daily oil cargo traffic has ground to a near halt. Around 20 oil tankers have passed through since the war started, compared to a normal average of about 100 per day. Iran is one of the world's significant oil producers and controls the northern shores, the Strait of Hormuz, despite this conflict. The IRG itself has continued shipping oil through the strait in almost the same volumes as before the war, earning cash to sustain itself. When Russia invaded Ukraine, crude oil prices rose about 50% in a few weeks, topping $126 a barrel, and that conflict put only 3 million barrels a day at risk. The Hormuz crisis has put 20 million barrels a day at risk. Let's do a Jack Cousteau and dive a little deeper into the process chain for New Zealand oil and why this is affecting you. The New Zealand fuel journey, from crude to your tank. The crude oil starting point. New Zealand imports virtually all of its crude oil and refined fuel from overseas. Since the closure of the Marsden Point refinery in Northland in 2022, which we did some pile testing up there on a solar project, but that's a story for another day. New Zealand no longer refines its own fuel domestically. making us entirely dependent on imported refined product. Before the closure, Marsden Point processed crude oil from a handful of sources, including local Taranaki fields, but today that era is over. New Zealand is now one of the few developed nations with no domestic refining capacity whatsoever. Where is our fuel refined? The majority of New Zealand's refined fuel comes from refineries in Singapore, South Korea, and some in Malaysia, with some products also sourced from Australia and the Middle East. Singapore in particular is one of the world's great refining hubs, sitting strategically at the crossroads of Middle Eastern crude supply and Asian demand. When you fill up at the petrol station in Christchurch or Auckland, the fuel in your tank was almost certainly processed thousands of kilometres away in a massive industry complex on the other side of the world. I'm going to dive a bit deeper now into how a refinery works. Crude oil on its own is useless. It's a thick, dark mix of hundreds of different hydrocarbon molecules. A refinery's job is to separate and transform those molecules into useful products. The process starts with distillation. Crude oil is heated to around 350 to 400 degrees Celsius and pumped into a tall distillation tower. Different hydrocarbon molecules boil at different temperatures, so they separate naturally as vapor rises up the tower. Lighter molecules rise higher, heavier ones sink, and are drawn off at different levels. From top to bottom of the tower, you get LPG, which is drawn off at the top. That's the lightest fraction. Petrol, gasoline, that's the next level down. Jet fuel, kerosene, that's the middle of the tower. Diesel's the next one down, a little lower. And heavy fuel oil is near the bottom, but not quite at the bottom. At the bottom we have the heaviest, which is bitumen and asphalt. That's drawn off the base. But distillation alone isn't enough. Refineries also use a process called cracking, essentially breaking apart large heavy molecules into smaller, more valuable lighter ones like petrol and diesel. This is where the real value is extracted. Modern refineries also run a hydrotreating process to remove sulfur and other impurities, which is why modern fuels burn cleaner than they did decades ago. As an example, a large Singapore refinery can process anywhere from 200,000 to 600,000 barrels of crude oil per day, and that's running 24/7. Once that's refined, the next part is loading that fuel onto a product tanker. So this is the shipping journey to New Zealand. This is different from the crude oil tankers and is specifically designed to carry refined fuels in separate compartments, allowing them to carry petrol, diesel, jet fuel on the same voyage without mixing. The journey from Singapore to New Zealand takes approximately 12 to 18 days, depending on the vessel and the destination port. So New Zealand's main fuel import terminals are in Auckland, Tauranga, Lyttelton, Wellington. Ships typically carry between about 30,000 to 100,000 tonnes of refined fuel per voyage. Once at port, the fuel is pumped ashore into large storage tanks before being distributed by road tanker to service stations around the country. Why this makes New Zealand vulnerable? This long, complex supply chain is exactly why Middle East tensions matter so much to Kiwi motorists. Every link in that chain, crude oil supply, refinery capacity, shipping routes, port availability, is a potential point of disruption, with no domestic refining and only 20 to 28 days of onshore fuel stocks at any given time. New Zealand has a very little buffer if something goes wrong upstream. The closure of Marsden Point remains controversial for exactly this reason. At the time, it was seen as an economic decision, cheaper to import refined fuel than to process it locally. In hindsight, with global supply chains under the kind of pressure we're seeing right now, many are questioning whether that was the right call. Now, some people will say the closure of Marsden Point was a mistake, that we should have kept our own refinery running for exactly this kind of situation. And on the surface, that sounds logical, but let's think about this for a moment, because I'm not sure this actually holds up. Here's the problem. Marsden Point didn't produce crude oil. It processed it. And where did that crude oil come from? The same place everyone else does, the Middle East. The same tankers, the same shipping lanes, the same Strait of Hormuzto. So even if Marsden Point was still running today, it would be sitting idle right now because you can't refine oil you can't get. A refinery without crude oil is just a very expansive collection of pipes and towers doing nothing. The real issue here isn't where the fuel gets processed, it's whether the crude oil can get out of the Middle East in the first place. That's the choke point. That's the vulnerability. Refining capacity in New Zealand wouldn't change the equation by a single barrel. In fact, you could argue that importing already refined product from Singapore actually gives us more flexibility, because Singapore draws crude from multiple sources across the Middle East, Africa, and even the Americas. We're not tied to a single crude stream. It's a bit of food for thought there. With the higher price, let's discuss in New Zealand how we can help save fuel. Some big points is pretty much how you drive. So accelerating gently and braking early, aggressive driving is one of the biggest fuel wasters. Driving at a steady speed, use cruise control on the open road. Keep to the speed limit, fuel consumption increases significantly above 90 kilometers an hour. Anticipate traffic ahead, so you're coasting rather than braking hard. Your car, keep tyres inflated to the correct pressure. Underinflated tyres increase rolling resistance and burn more fuel. Service your car regularly, and clean air filters and fresh spark plugs. That makes a real difference. Remove roof racks, bike racks, and roof boxes when not in use. They create drag. Don't carry unnecessary weight in the boot. Combined errands into one trip rather than multiple short trips. Cold engines use significantly more fuel. Park and new line park in the first spot you find rather than cruising for a closer one. At lower speeds, open windows instead of using your aircon. At highway speeds, use aircon. Open windows creates more drags than the aircon costs. Fill up at the cheapest station. Fill up early in the week. Prices often rise on Thursdays and Fridays ahead of the weekend. And to be honest, we probably should all be doing this. Come to think of it, probably don't leave your windows open in the middle of winter. That's just really cold. As we love facts, let's have a look at this. Say your car uses 8 litres per 100 kilometres. At 90 kilometres an hour, that's a fairly typical family car. At 100 kilometres an hour, this would rise to approximately 8.8 litres per 100 kilometres. That's 10% more. So on a 300 kilometre trip, say Christchurch to Kaikoura and back, that's roughly 2.4 extra litres at $3.27 per litre. That's about $7.85 extra for that single trip. That doesn't sound huge, but across a year of highway driving, it's going to add up quickly. And over 100 kilometers an hour, the fuel increases exponentially, which we wouldn't be doing. Well, that's a wrap on our very first episode of What's Current. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Because I'll be honest here, putting this together has been a bit of an eye-opener, even for me. From a narrow stretch of water on the other side of the world to the prices on the pump at your local Z, Phil or BP. It's all connected and it matters right here in New Zealand. As we head into autumn and winter starts knocking on the door, keep warm, drive safe, and maybe think twice before you wind that window down on the motorway. Your wallet will thank you. Next week, we're going to dive into the world of electricity. What's happening with prices, and what's the future of energy in this country actually looks like. It's a big topic and one that affects every single Kiwi household. If you've enjoyed today's show, please hit subscribe whenever you're listening. It costs you nothing and it matters the world to a brand new podcast. And if you know someone who'd enjoy What's Current, share it with them. Word of mouth is how we grow. I'm Campbell McMath. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.